Hi, everyone. This is Steve Turnbull from First Lutheran Church, coming to you today from my home office and talking about the next chapter that we are going to read together in the Big God story. We're reading now in the story of the Old Testament from some of the prophets that come at the end of the Old Testament in the Bible, and we're reading them in the season of the Christian year that's called Advent. And typically, this is a time of the year leading up to Christmas when we do two things. We look forward to celebrating the birth of the Messiah, the birth of Jesus among us, and also look forward to his return again to this world. And it's during this time, traditionally, that Christians have often read from the prophets in the Old Testament who looked forward to Jesus' birth in the first place. And this Sunday, we're going to read some of the prophecies, some of the visions from the ancient prophet Isaiah. And some of the visions that God gave to Isaiah, some of the messages that God gave to Isaiah, are just so beautiful, so inspiring as descriptions of the salvation, the saved world that God intends to create for his people through the arrival of his Messiah. In fact, sometimes they're so inspiring and so beautiful that it takes something like that for me sometimes to read those and be resensitized to just looking at our own world and realizing how far we still are from that. But what really gets me, and where I think this really becomes relevant for us when we read these passages, is to recognize that these are things that Jesus identified himself with, that he said this is what he was about. One time, the character John the Baptist, who was another person who lived nearly the same time as Jesus, sent some of his followers to Jesus to ask Jesus, are you the one that we should expect, or should we wait for somebody else? Are you the Savior or not? And Jesus sent back to John, and he said, you go tell John what you've seen and heard. And then Jesus says, look what happens here. The lame walk, the mute speak, the deaf hear again, the dead are raised. And he's quoting passages from these visions from the prophet Isaiah and saying, yeah, God's new world, it comes in me. That's a big claim, obviously. And what I think makes that so interesting, the question that we have to face when we read these passages and learn from, is that we take a look around at our world and say, is this really the world that we'd be living in if Jesus were in that position of authority? Is this the world God really intends? Because it doesn't feel like it. That's the question that we'll face when we gather for worship this weekend on Sunday morning, and then learn from that how it is that how do we understand what God has done in Jesus? How do we understand what we're hoping for God to do in Jesus? And maybe of the most direct relevance to us, how do we live in a way now that makes sense with what God is doing in Jesus? I'm looking forward to reading these Bible passages and learning from them together this Sunday, and most importantly, growing as individuals and as a community, more and more like Christ, and more like this world that God has promised.